The iron bars groaned as they bent, just enough for two men to squeeze through. Jake and Mitch, their prison uniforms caked with desert dust, stumbled into the scorching afternoon sun. Freedom tasted like sand and desperation. "There," Mitch panted, pointing to a distant ranch. "Looks quiet. Might be our ticket out of here." Jake nodded, his eyes narrowing against the glare. "Let's hope the owner's feeling charitable." Little did they know, the silent rancher they were about to encounter was a legend they'd only heard whispered about in the darkest corners of their cells. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Whispering Winds Ranch, sprawled across the sun-baked earth like a defiant oasis in the unforgiving desert. Weathered fences stretched as far as the eye could see, enclosing fields where cattle grazed lazily under the scorching sun. The main house, a sturdy two-story structure of wood and stone, stood sentinel over the property, its windows reflecting the harsh sunlight like watchful eyes. John Hawkins, known to his neighbors simply as the Silent Rancher, moved through his daily routine with the efficiency of a well-oiled machine. His calloused hands worked tirelessly, mending fences, tending to livestock, and maintaining the ranch with a single-minded focus that kept the loneliness at bay. At 55, John's face was a weathered map of hardship and resilience. Deep lines etched around his eyes spoke of years squinting against the sun, while his perpetual frown hinted at sorrows long buried. His tall, lean frame still carried the strength and agility of a much younger man, honed by decades of hard work and harsher living. The ranch hands, a small but loyal crew, had learned to interpret John's silent commands through subtle gestures and knowing looks. They respected his quiet ways, understanding that behind his taciturn demeanor lay a keen mind and a fair employer. As the sun began its descent, painting the sky in vibrant oranges and purples, John stood on his porch, a steaming cup of coffee in hand. His dark eyes scanned the horizon, a nightly ritual born of habit and an unshakable wariness. In the distance, a dust cloud caught his attention, too small to be a cattle drive, too purposeful to be tumbleweeds. Something was coming. John's free hand instinctively moved to his hip, where a well-worn holster sat empty. He hadn't carried a gun in years, not since. He shook off the memory, turning to enter the house. In his bedroom, he knelt before an old trunk, its wood scarred and faded. With a deep breath, he opened it, revealing a pair of gleaming revolvers, nestled in worn leather. For a long moment, John stared at the weapons, relics of a past he'd tried to leave behind. Then, with a resigned sigh, he strapped on the gun belt, the familiar weight both comforting and terrifying. As night fell over the Whispering Winds Ranch, John Hawkins prepared for whatever the darkness might bring, unaware that his silent world was about to be shattered by the arrival of two desperate men. As John Hawkins stood on his porch, the weight of the gun belt around his waist stirred memories he'd long tried to bury. His mind drifted back to a time when he was known by another name, Swift Hand Hawkins, the most feared gunslinger west of the Mississippi. 20 years ago, John had been a legend, his name whispered in saloons and around campfires. His lightning-fast draw and deadly accuracy had made him both revered and feared. But with each notch on his gun, the weight on his conscience grew heavier. The turning point came during a dusty showdown in Tombstone. John faced off against a young hotshot, barely more than a boy, who'd called him out to make a name for himself. As they stood in the street, the kid's hands shaking as he reached for his gun, John saw something in his eyes. Fear, yes, but also a flicker of the man he might become if given the chance. In that moment, John made a choice. He drew faster than ever before, but instead of shooting to kill, he fired a precise shot that disarmed the young man without harming him. The crowd was stunned into silence, and in that quiet, John Hawkins holstered his guns for what he thought would be the last time. He left Tombstone that night, riding until he found this remote patch of land. Here, far from his reputation, he built the Whispering Winds Ranch with his own 2 hands. He vowed to live a life of peace, to create rather than destroy. For years, John worked the land in silent penance, speaking only when absolutely necessary. The locals, sensing the weight of his unspoken past, respected his privacy. Rumors occasionally drifted through about the true identity of the silent rancher, but none dared to confront him directly. As time passed, John's legend faded into myth. Swift hand, Hawkins became a story told to wide-eyed children, a cautionary tale about the price of violence. But for John, the memories remained vivid: the smell of gunpowder, the sound of a hammer cocking, the weight of lives taken. Now, as he watched the approaching dust cloud, John felt the familiar tension coiling in his muscles. His eyes, once sharp enough to spot a buzzing fly at 50 paces, hadn't lost their keen edge. He knew trouble was coming, and part of him, a part he'd tried to silence for 2 decades, thrilled at the prospect. But John Hawkins was no longer the man he'd been. He'd built something here, something worth protecting. As he checked the chambers of his revolvers, he made a silent vow. He would defend his home and his new life, but he would not become the killer he once was. The guns were a last resort, a reluctant acknowledgement that sometimes peace must be defended with the threat of violence. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the ranch, John Hawkins prepared to face whatever was coming. The silent rancher and the legendary gunslinger were about to collide, and the outcome would determine not just his fate, but the fate of the 2 desperate men approaching in the gathering darkness. The night had barely settled over the Whispering Winds Ranch when Jake and Mitch stumbled through the underbrush, their prison uniforms torn and dirty from their desperate flight. The ranch house loomed before them, a promise of safety and resources they desperately needed. Jake, the shorter of the 2 but wiry with nervous energy, glanced at his companion. "Remember the plan," he hissed. "We get in, get what we need, and get out. No unnecessary trouble." Mitch, a hulking man with hands like sledgehammers, nodded grimly. Yeah, I ain't looking to add more years to my sentence, but if that rancher gives us trouble, we handle it," Jake finished, his voice hard. "One way or another." As they crept closer to the house, John Hawkins watched from the shadows of his porch. His keen eyes had spotted the men long before they reached the edge of his property. Their furtive movements and tattered clothes told him all he needed to know. Trouble had indeed come calling. John stepped into the light, his posture relaxed but alert. "Evening, gentlemen," he called out, his voice rough from disuse. "Seems you've had a long journey. What brings you to my ranch at this hour?" Jake and Mitch froze, caught off guard by John's sudden appearance. They exchanged a quick glance before Jake stepped forward, forcing a friendly smile. "Evening, sir. We're, just passing through. Our car broke down a few miles back, and we were hoping you might have a phone we could use to call for help." John's face remained impassive, but his eyes narrowed slightly. "No phone out here," he said simply. "Nearest town's about 20 miles east. You boys look like you could use some water before you start walking." Mitch tensed, ready for action, but Jake placed a restraining hand on his arm. "That's mighty kind of you, mister. We'd appreciate that." John nodded and turned to enter the house, keeping the 2 men in his peripheral vision. As he filled 2 glasses with water, he could hear them whispering urgently outside. "Did you see that gun belt?" Mitch was saying. "Old man's packing heat." "Shut up," Jake hissed back. "Don't spook him. We play this cool. Maybe we can get more than just water. A vehicle, supplies." John returned with the water, handing the glasses to the men. As they drank gratefully, he studied them more closely. The younger one, Jake, had the shifty eyes. of a born liar, while Mitch's barely contained aggression was evident in every movement. "You boys got names?" John asked casually. Jake lowered his glass, that forced smile back in place. "I'm Tom, and this here's my brother Sam. We sure appreciate your hospitality, Mr. Hawkins," John supplied, noting the lie without comment. John Hawkins. At the name, both men stiffened almost imperceptibly. John saw the flash of recognition in their eyes, quickly masked. His reputation, it seemed, had not been entirely forgotten. "Well, Mr. Hawkins," Jake said, his voice slightly higher than before, "we don't want to impose. If you could just point us in the direction of town, we'll be on our way." John gestured toward the east. "Follow the road. Can't miss it." He paused, then added, "Unless you boys would prefer to wait until morning. Got an old bunkhouse out back. Not much, but it's shelter." The offer hung in the air, loaded with unspoken tension. Jake and Mitch exchanged another look, a silent communication passing between them. "That's real generous of you, Mr. Hawkins," Jake finally said. "If you're sure it's no trouble—" "No trouble," John replied, his face unreadable. As he led them to the bunkhouse, John could feel the weight of their stares on his back. He knew they were sizing him up, looking for weaknesses, planning their next move. What they didn't realize was that John Hawkins was doing the same. In the dusty confines of the bunkhouse, Jake and Mitch settled in, their minds racing with the implications of where they'd found themselves. "You think it's really him?" Mitch whispered. "Swift Hand Hawkins?" Jake shrugged, but his eyes glittered with a dangerous mix of fear and opportunity. "If it is, we just stumbled onto the biggest score of our lives. One way or another, boys, our luck's about to change." As the night deepened, 3 men lay awake, 2 prisoners dreaming of freedom and fortune, and 1 silent rancher prepared to defend everything he'd built, no matter the cost. Dawn broke over the Whispering Winds ranch, painting the sky in hues of pink and gold. John Hawkins had been awake for hours, his old habits as a gunslinger making sleep elusive when potential threats lurked nearby. He moved through his morning routine with deliberate calm, lighting the stove for coffee and stepping out onto the porch to survey his land. The bunkhouse door creaked open, and Jake emerged, squinting against the early morning light. He approached John with an easy smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Morning, Mr. Hawkins. Sure appreciate you putting us up for the night." John nodded silently, pouring a cup of coffee and offering it to Jake. The younger man accepted it, gratefully, and for a moment they stood in awkward silence, sipping their drinks and watching the sun climb higher. "Quite a spread you've got here," Jake ventured, his eyes roaming over the ranch. "Must be worth a pretty penny." "It's home," John replied simply, his tone discouraging further questions. Mitch joined them, his hulking frame filling the doorway of the bunkhouse. He nodded gruffly at John, accepting a cup of coffee with a mumbled thanks. "So, Mr. Hawkins," Jake continued, undeterred by John's reticence, "you been out here long? Must get lonely way out here by yourself." John's eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly. "I manage," Jake chuckled, a forced sound that grated on John's nerves. "Course you do. Man like you probably used to taking care of yourself." The implication hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. John remained silent, his eyes fixed on the horizon. Mitch, growing impatient with the subtle dance, spoke up. "Look, Mr. Hawkins, we're grateful and all, but we need to be moving on. You wouldn't happen to have a vehicle we could borrow, would you, just to get us to town?" John turned to face them fully, his expression unreadable. "No!" Jake's smile faltered for a moment before he recovered. "Come on now, surely a successful rancher like yourself has a truck or something. We'd bring it right back, Scout's honor." "You're not Scouts," John said flatly, "and you're not getting any of my vehicles." The tension in the air thickened, Mitch's hands curling into fists at his sides. Jake placed a restraining hand on his partner's arm, but his own eyes had hardened. "Now, Mr. Hawkins," Jake said, his voice losing its friendly edge, We're just asking for a little help here. Wouldn't want things to get difficult." John's hand moved casually to rest on the butt of his revolver. "Things are already difficult, boys. Question is, how much more difficult do you want to make them?" For a long moment, nobody moved. The only sound was the whisper of the wind through the dry grass and the distant lowing of cattle. Finally, Jake backed down, raising his hands in a placating gesture. "No need for that, Mr. Hawkins. We're not looking for trouble. We'll just be on our way then. Thanks for the hospitality." John watched as they retreated to the bunkhouse, presumably to gather their meager belongings. He knew this wasn't over. The look in Jake's eyes told him they weren't about to give up so easily. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, John Hawkins prepared for a day unlike any he'd faced in years. The silent rancher was ready, but somewhere, deep inside, swift-hand Hawkins stirred, sensing the coming storm. Inside the bunkhouse, Jake paced like a caged animal, his mind racing with possibilities and frustrations. Mitch sat on one of the rickety beds, his massive frame making the old springs creak ominously. "We can't just walk away, Jake," Mitch growled. "Not when we're sitting on a gold mine here." Jake ran a hand through his hair, his eyes gleaming with a dangerous light. I know. But we gotta play this smart. That old man out there, if he really is Swift-Hand Hawkins—" "You think it's true?" Mitch interrupted. "The stories about him taking out entire gangs single-handedly," Jake shrugged, "don't matter if they're true or not. What matters is he believes them, and he's got the hardware to back it up. We need a plan." As they huddled together, whispering furiously, John Hawkins moved about his ranch with practiced efficiency. He checked on his cattle, mended a section of fence, all the while keeping a watchful eye on the bunkhouse. One of his ranch hands, a young man named Tommy, approached him with concern etched on his face. "Mr. Hawkins, is everything all right? Those fellas in the bunkhouse, they don't look like your usual guests." John considered the young man for a moment before responding. "Tommy, I want you to take the rest of the boys and head into town. Stock up on supplies, take your time about it. Might be good to stay in town tonight, make a real outing of it." Tommy's brow furrowed. "But sir, the north pasture still needs—" "It'll keep," John interrupted firmly. "You boys deserve a break. Go on now, get moving." As Tommy rounded up the other hands, confusion and worry evident in their hurried conversations, John felt a twinge of guilt. He was fond of his workers, and sending them away didn't sit right with him. But he knew in his gut that things were going to get ugly, and he couldn't risk their safety. Back in the bunkhouse, Jake had finally formulated a plan. "All right, here's what we're going to do. We play nice, act like we're leaving. Once we're out of sight, we circle back. Old man's going to have to sleep sometime, and when he does—" Mitch grinned, cracking his knuckles. "We take what we want." Jake nodded, his eyes cold. "Everything of value, including those fancy guns of his. A piece of history like that, we could retire on what collectors would pay." As the day wore on, the ranch fell into an uneasy quiet. John watched from his porch as Jake and Mitch emerged from the bunkhouse, their expressions carefully neutral. "Mr. Hawkins," Jake called out, that forced friendliness back in his voice. "We'll be heading out now. Thanks again for everything." John nodded silently, his eyes never leaving them as they started down the long driveway. He knew they weren't really leaving, could feel it in his bones. The air itself seemed charged with anticipation, like the moments before a thunderstorm breaks. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and reds, John Hawkins sat in his darkened living room, his revolvers laid out on the coffee table before him. He ran a cloth over them methodically, each movement a meditation on what was to come. Outside, hidden in the growing shadows, Jake and Mitch crept back toward the ranch house. Their eyes glittered with greed and desperation, unaware that they were walking into a trap laid by a man who had spent decades preparing for this very moment. The stage was set. The silent rancher and the escaped prisoners were on a collision course. and only one side would walk away when the dust settled. The moon hung low and full over the Whispering Winds ranch, casting long shadows across the yard. John Hawkins sat motionless in his darkened living room, his keen ears attuned to every sound. The creak of a floorboard, the whisper of boot on gravel. Nothing escaped his notice. Outside, Jake and Mitch crept towards the house, their movements slow and deliberate. Jake held a rusty crowbar, while Mitch clutched a length of rope. They paused at the edge of the porch, exchanging a silent nod, before Jake reached for the door handle. The moment his fingers touched the cool metal, a voice rang out from the darkness. "I wouldn't do that if I were you boys." Jake and Mitch froze, their eyes straining to pierce the gloom. Slowly, John Hawkins emerged from the shadows, his revolvers glinting in the moonlight. "Mr. Hawkins," Jake stammered, trying to regain his composure, We thought we heard a noise. Came back to check on you." John's expression remained impassive. "With a crowbar and rope? Mighty thoughtful of you." Mitch tensed, ready to spring, but John's voice cut through the night like a whip crack. "Don't even think about it, big man. I may be old, but I can still put 2 bullets through you before you take your next breath." For a long moment, nobody moved. The only sound was the wind whispering through the dry grass and the rapid breathing of the 2 would-be intruders. Finally, Jake lowered the crowbar, his mind racing for a way out. "Look, Mr. Hawkins, we don't want any trouble. We're just desperate. Men in a desperate situation. Maybe we can work something out?" John's eyes narrowed. "You boys are in a world of trouble already. Prison breaks tend to ruffle feathers." Jake's face paled. "How did you—" "I wasn't born yesterday," John interrupted. "And news travels, even out here." Mitch, his patience wearing thin, growled, "Enough talk. He's just one old man. We can take him." Before Jake could stop him, Mitch charged forward, his massive frame barreling towards John. What happened next was almost too fast to follow. John sidestepped with a grace that belied his years, his left hand snaking out to grab Mitch's outstretched arm. Using the bigger man's momentum against him, John sent him sprawling into the dirt. In the same fluid motion, his right hand brought a revolver to bear on Jake, who stood frozen in disbelief. "That's one," John said calmly, as if he were discussing the weather. "Care to try for 2? Mitch groaned from the ground, the wind knocked out of him. Jake raised his hand slowly, the crowbar clattering to the porch. "Now what?" Jake asked, his voice barely a whisper. John considered for a moment. "Now you boys are going to walk to that barn over yonder. There's some rope inside. You're going to tie yourselves up nice and tight. In the morning we'll take a little ride to see the sheriff." As Jake helped Mitch to his feet, his mind was whirling. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. But for now they had no choice but to comply. John watched them shuffle towards the barn, his revolver never wavering. As they disappeared inside, he allowed himself a small sigh. The confrontation he'd been dreading for 20 years had finally come, and Swift-Hand Hawkins had answered the call. But as the adrenaline began to fade, John felt the weight of his years settling back onto his shoulders. He knew this was just the beginning. Jake and Mitch were desperate men, and desperate men were dangerous. As the night wore on, John Hawkins stood vigil, watching the barn and waiting for dawn. The silent rancher and the legendary gunslinger had merged once again, and the coming day would determine which one would survive. As the first light of dawn painted the sky, John Hawkins approached the barn, his steps measured and cautious. He pushed open the heavy wooden door, revolver at the ready, only to find Jake and Mitch exactly where he'd left them, bound tightly with rope, glaring up at him from the hay-strewn floor. "Rise and shine, boys," John said, his voice gruff from a sleepless night. "Time for a little chat before our trip to town." Jake struggled to sit up, wincing as the ropes bit into his wrists. "What's there to talk about? You've got us trussed. Up like Christmas turkeys." John pulled up a weathered wooden chair, settling himself before the prisoners. "I want to know why. Why here? Why my ranch?" Mitch spat into the hay. Just dumb luck, old man. Could have been any ranch, but Jake's eyes had taken on a calculating gleam. No, Mitch. No more lies. He turned to John, a hint of respect in his voice. We knew exactly where we were coming. The legendary Swift-Hand Hawkins, living out his days as a humble rancher. Do you know what collectors would pay for your guns? For a piece of the legend? John's face remained impassive, but something flickered in his eyes, a mix of pain and resignation. That life is long behind me, is it? Jake pressed. Because from where I'm sitting, Swift-Hand Hawkins is alive and well. You took down Mitch like he was a rowdy calf. As they talked, Mitch had been slowly, imperceptibly working at his bonds. John, his attention focused on Jake, didn't notice the big man's hands gradually gaining slack. You boys don't know the first thing about that life, John said, his voice low and dangerous. The weight of it, the cost. Jake leaned forward, as much as his bonds would allow. Then tell us, what made the great Swift-Hand Hawkins hang up his guns and hide out here in the middle of nowhere? For a long moment John was silent, his eyes distant as if seeing something far beyond the barn walls. When he spoke, his voice was heavy with memory. 20 years ago, I was hired to protect a wagon train. Good people, just looking for a fresh start out west. We were ambushed by a gang of outlaws. I took them all down, just like the stories say. But in the chaos, a stray bullet. He paused, swallowing hard. A little girl. Couldn't have been. More than 6. She died in her mother's arms. The barn fell silent, save for the soft cooing of pigeons in the rafters. Even Mitch had stopped his subtle struggles, caught up in the weight of John's words. I realized then that the life I was living, the legend I'd become, it came with a price paid in innocent blood. So I walked away, found this place, built something that creates life instead of taking it. Jake's expression had softened, a flicker of genuine sympathy crossing his features, but it was quickly replaced by a hardened resolve. A touching story, Mr. Hawkins, but it doesn't change the fact that we're sitting on a gold mine here. Your guns, your legend, it's worth a fortune to the right people. John's eyes snapped back to the present, fixing Jake with a steely gaze. And you think I'm just going to let you walk out of here with my past, with everything I've worked to put behind me? But before Jake could respond, several things happened at once. Mitch, having finally worked free of his bonds, lunged forward. With surprising speed, John, caught off guard, toppled backward off his chair, and from outside the barn came the unmistakable sound of approaching vehicles. As dust billowed through the open barn door, John found himself grappling with Mitch. On the hay-strewn floor, Jake, still bound, was shouting something, but his words were drowned out by a booming voice from outside. John Hawkins, this is Sheriff Tanner. We got your message. Come on out, nice and easy. The struggle on the barn floor ceased, both John and Mitch freezing at the sound of the sheriff's voice. Jake's eyes darted between them, a mixture of confusion and anger on his face. Message, he spat. What message? John used the momentary distraction to shove Mitch off him, quickly regaining his feet and retrieving his fallen revolver. Did you really think I wouldn't have a way to call for help out? Here, he said, a hint of the old gunslinger's smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. Outside, the sound of car doors slamming and boots on gravel signaled the arrival of reinforcements. Sheriff Tanner's voice rang out again. John, you all right in there? Everything's under control, Sheriff, John called back, his eyes never leaving Mitch and Jake. Got 2 guests here, eager to meet you. As the sheriff and his deputies entered the barn, the full weight of their situation seemed to finally sink in for Jake and Mitch. The fight drained out of them, replaced by the grim resignation of men who knew their run was over. While the deputies secured the prisoners, Sheriff Tanner approached John, concern etched on his weathered face. You okay, John? When we got that silent alarm signal, I feared the worst. John nodded, suddenly feeling every one of his years I'm fine, Bill. Just some unwelcome visitors who bit off more than they could chew. As Jake was led past them in handcuffs, he paused, looking at John with a mix of respect and regret. You really are him, aren't you? Swift-Hand Hawkins, the legend. John met his gaze steadily. Swift-Hand Hawkins died a long time ago, son. I'm just a rancher trying to live in peace. The sheriff's eyebrows shot up at this exchange, but he said nothing, merely guiding Jake toward the waiting patrol car. As the dust settled and the sound of sirens faded into the distance, John Hawkins stood on his porch, watching the sun climb higher in the sky. The events of the past day had stirred up ghosts he'd long thought laid to rest, yet as he looked out over his ranch, at the life he'd built with his own 2 hands, he felt a sense of peace settling over him. The legend of Swift-Hand Hawkins might never truly die, but John had finally found a way to live with it. As he turned to head back inside, he knew that whatever challenges tomorrow might bring, he was ready to face them, not as a gunslinger, but as a man who had found his true strength in the quiet dignity of an honest life. Sheriff Bill Tanner sat behind his desk, fingers drumming an anxious rhythm on the worn wood. The events at the Whispering Winds Ranch had stirred up more than just 2 escaped convicts. They'd unearthed a legend that many thought was long buried. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. "Come in," he called, straightening in his chair. Deputy Sarah Rollins entered, a file clutched in her hands. "Sheriff, I've got that information you asked for on John Hawkins." Tanner nodded, gesturing for her to continue. Sarah opened the file, her eyes widening slightly as she read. "Sir, if this is accurate, John Hawkins isn't just any retired gunslinger. He's the Swift-Hand Hawkins. The man's got more confirmed takedowns than any lawman or bounty hunter in the territory's history." The sheriff sighed heavily. "I was afraid of that. What else?" Sarah flipped through the pages. "There's more, sir. It seems Hawkins disappeared right after a controversial shooting in Tombstone. A young gunslinger was killed, but witnesses say the kid never even cleared his holster. Some called it murder." Tanner leaned back in his chair, his face troubled. "So we've got a living legend with a possible murder charge living right under our noses. Wonderful." Just then, another knock came at the door. Deputy Tom Harris poked his head in. "Sheriff, there's a call for you. Says it's urgent." Tanner picked up the phone, his frown deepening as he listened. After a terse, "I understand," he hung up, his expression grim. "Pack your bags," he told his deputies. "We're headed to the state capital. The governor wants to talk about John Hawkins." The 3-hour drive to the capital was tense, filled with speculation about what awaited them. When they arrived at the governor's mansion, they were immediately ushered into a plush office. Governor Richard Hawthorne, a man known for his political ambitions, greeted them with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Sheriff Tanner, thank you for coming so quickly. We have a situation on our hands." Tanner nodded cautiously. "Regarding John Hawkins, I assume?" The governor's smile tightened. "Indeed. It seems our quiet rancher has quite a colorful past, a past that could be very useful to us." "Sir?" Tanner questioned, a feeling of unease growing in his gut. Hawthorne leaned forward, his voice low and intense. "The border syndicate has been gaining power. They've got politicians in their pockets, law enforcement on the run. We need someone who can take the fight to them, someone with a reputation that will make them think twice." Realization dawned on Tanner's face. "You want to recruit Hawkins?" The governor nodded. "Precisely. Swift-Hand Hawkins coming out of retirement to take down the border syndicate. It's the stuff of legend. The boost to public morale alone would be invaluable." Tanner shook his head. "With all due respect, Governor, John Hawkins left that life behind. He's built something new, something peaceful. We can't just—" "Can't we?" Hawthorne interrupted, his eyes cold. "Let's not forget, Sheriff, there's still an open murder investigation from Tombstone. It would be a shame if that were to resurface now. The implications hung heavy in the air. Tanner felt the weight of the badge on his chest, suddenly seeming much heavier. "So, what exactly are you asking me to do?" he asked, his voice tight. The governor smiled, but it was a predator's smile. "Convince him, Sheriff. Convince John Hawkins to be swift-hand one last time for the good of the territory." As Tanner and his deputies left the governor's mansion, the weight of their task pressed down on them. They had come seeking justice for two escaped convicts. Now they found themselves caught between a legendary gunslinger seeking peace and a powerful politician willing to destroy that peace for his own ends. The drive back to their small town was silent, each lost in their own thoughts. As the familiar landscape of home came into view, Sheriff Bill Tanner made a decision. He would talk to John Hawkins, but not to recruit him. He would warn him, give him a chance to disappear again if he wanted. Because sometimes, Tanner realized, true justice meant standing against the very law you'd sworn to uphold. The sun was setting over the Whispering Winds Ranch when Sheriff Tanner's patrol car kicked up dust on the long driveway. John Hawkins stood on his porch, watching the approaching vehicle with a mixture of curiosity and wariness. As Tanner stepped out of the car, John noticed the tension in his old friend's shoulders. "Evening, Bill," he called out. "Didn't expect to see you back so soon." Tanner removed his hat, running a hand through his graying hair. "John, we need to talk. Mind if we go inside?" Once seated in John's modest living room, Tanner recounted his meeting with the governor. John listened silently, his face betraying no emotion, but his hands clenched tightly on the arms of his chair. When Tanner finished, John stood and walked to the window, gazing out at his land. "So," he said quietly, "the past never really lets go, does it?" Tanner sighed. "I'm sorry, John. I came here to warn you. If you want to disappear again, I'll do what I can to buy you some time." John turned, a hint of a smile on his weathered face. "Appreciate that, Bill. But I'm done running. This is my home now." "Then what will you do?" Tanner asked. "I'll tell the governor thanks, but no thanks," John replied. "And if he wants to dig up Tombstone, well, I've been carrying that weight for 20 years. Maybe it's time to set it down." A knock at the door interrupted them. Deputy Rollins entered, her face pale. "Sheriff, we've got a problem. Jake and Mitch, they've escaped." Tanner jumped to his feet. "What? How?" "We're not sure, sir," Rollins replied. "But there's more. We intercepted a message. They're working for the border syndicate." The room fell silent as the implications sank in. John's eyes narrowed. "So that's their game. They weren't after my guns for collectors. The syndicate wants swift-hand Hawkins out of the way before making their big move." Tanner nodded grimly. "And the governor wants to use you as bait. Whether you agree or not." John's hand moved unconsciously to his hip, where his gun belt would have hung in days past. "Well then," he said, his voice taking on a steely edge, "seems like we've got a choice to make." Tanner studied his friend's face, seeing the legendary gunslinger emerging from behind the quiet rancher's eyes. "We?" he asked. John smiled, but it was the hard smile of a man preparing for battle. "You came here to warn me, Bill. That tells me everything I need to know about where you stand. Question is, are you ready to stand against a corrupt governor and a criminal syndicate?" Tanner straightened, squaring his shoulders. "John, I've been sheriff here for 15 years. This is my home, too. If it needs defending, I'll defend it." "Deputy," Rollins stepped forward. "Count me in too, sir. Someone's got to watch your backs." John nodded, respect evident in his eyes. "All right, then. But if we're going to do this, we do it my way. No badges, no official sanction. Just 3 people trying to protect their home." Tanner removed his badge, placing it on the coffee table. Rollins followed suit. "So, what's the plan?" Tanner asked. John's eyes glinted with a fire that hadn't been seen in 2 decades. "First, we prepare. The syndicate thinks they're dealing with a washed-up old gunslinger. Let's show them how wrong they are." As night fell over the Whispering Winds Ranch, an unlikely alliance was forged. A legendary gunslinger, a principled sheriff, and a determined deputy, united against corruption and violence, standing as the last line of defense for their home. The quiet rancher was gone. In his place stood Swift-Hand Hawkins, ready to make his final stand, but this time he wouldn't be standing alone. Dawn broke over the Whispering Winds ranch, painting the sky in hues of pink and gold, but for the three figures moving purposefully about the property, there was no time to admire the view. John Hawkins, Sheriff Tanner, and Deputy Rollins had spent the night preparing for the storm they knew was coming. John stood on his porch, surveying the land he'd called home for 2 decades. His eyes, sharper than a man his age had any right to possess, scanned the horizon for any sign of movement. Behind him, the sound of a whetstone on metal rang out as Tanner sharpened his hunting knife. "You really think they'll come in force?" Tanner asked, pausing in his work. John nodded, his expression grim. "The border syndicate doesn't do anything halfway. They'll want to make an example of us." Deputy Rollins emerged from the barn, carrying an armful of old farm tools. "Found these," she said, dropping them on the porch. "Might come in handy for setting up some surprises." John allowed himself a small smile. The young deputy had proven to be resourceful and quick-thinking, traits that might just keep them alive in the coming fight. As the sun climbed higher, they went about their preparations with grim determination. Tanner and Rollins following. John's instructions set up makeshift barricades and traps around the property. John himself spent hours in the barn, emerging with a collection of firearms that made Tanner's eyes widen. "Thought you'd given all this up," the sheriff remarked, eyeing a particularly nasty-looking shotgun. John's face was unreadable as he checked the weapon's action. "Never hurts to be prepared," was all he said. By midday, the ranch had been transformed into a fortress. Hidden pitfalls dotted the approaches, barricades of hay bales and overturned wagons provided cover, and every window of the house had been reinforced. As they sat down to a quick meal, Tanner couldn't help but ask the question that had been nagging at him. "John, about Tombstone, what really happened?" For a long moment John was silent, his eyes focused on something far away. When he spoke, his voice was low and heavy with memory. "It was a mistake. The kid, he was so young, so eager to make a name for himself. I tried to talk him down, but he wouldn't listen. When he reached for his gun, I reacted on instinct. It was over before he even touched his holster." John's eyes met Tanner's, filled with a pain that 2 decades hadn't managed to dull. "I didn't mean to kill him, but in that life, intentions don't count for much. That's when I knew I had to walk away." Rollins, who had been listening intently, spoke up. "But sir, that sounds like self-defense. Surely the law isn't always just," John interrupted gently. "And sometimes the truth doesn't matter as much as the story people want to believe," Tanner nodded solemnly. "Well, for what it's worth, I believe you, John, and I'm glad you're on our side." As afternoon faded into evening, a tense quiet settled. Over the ranch, John stood at the window, watching the sun sink towards the horizon. "They'll come at night," he said softly, "when they think we'll be off guard." Tanner and Rollins joined him, their faces reflected in the glass. For a moment, they stood in silence, 3 unlikely allies preparing to face impossible odds. "Whatever happens," John said, turning to face them, "I want you both to know that I'm grateful. You didn't have to stand with me, but you chose to. That means more than you know." Tanner clapped a hand on John's shoulder. "We're not just standing with you, John. We're standing for something bigger, for justice, for our home." Rollins nodded in agreement. "It's an honor to fight alongside you both." As darkness fell, they took up their positions, John in the house, Tanner in the barn, and Rollins in a hastily constructed blind near the property's edge. Each was armed, alert, and ready for whatever the night might bring. In the distance, the faint sound of engines could be heard, growing steadily louder. The border syndicate was coming. The calm was over. The storm was about to break. The rumble of engines grew louder, shattering the night's silence. John Hawkins stood in the darkened living room of his ranch house, his weathered hands steady on his revolver. Through the window he could see dust clouds approaching, illuminated by harsh headlights. "Here they come," he murmured into his radio. "Everyone stay sharp." From her hidden position, Deputy Rollins counted the vehicles. "I make it 6 trucks, maybe 30 men," she reported, her voice tense but controlled. In the barn, Sheriff Tanner's grip tightened on his shotgun. "Seems the syndicate isn't taking any chances." The trucks fanned out as they approached the ranch, forming a loose semicircle. Engines cut off, plunging the area into an eerie silence, broken only by the sound of car doors opening and booted feet hitting dirt. A voice called out, amplified by a megaphone. "John Hawkins, we know you're in there. Come out now, and nobody else has to get hurt." John recognized the voice. Jake, the escaped prisoner who had started this whole mess. He moved to the porch, staying in the shadows. "That's mighty considerate of you, Jake," he called back, his voice carrying easily in the still night air. "But I think we both know that's not how this is going to go." A chorus of clicks echoed across the yard as weapons were readied. Jake's voice came again, tinged with frustration. "Don't be a fool, old man. You're outnumbered and outgunned. The syndicate wants you out of the picture one way or another. Don't make this harder than it needs to be." John's response was calm, almost conversational. "You know, Jake, there's something you should understand about legends." He paused, letting the tension build. "They don't become legends by backing down from a fight." For a moment, silence reigned. Then, with a roar of anger, Jake shouted, "Take him down!" The night erupted in a cacophony of gunfire. Bullets whizzed through the air, splintering wood and shattering glass. John dove for cover, his own gun barking in response. From her hidden position, Rollins opened fire, her precise shots taking down 2 syndicate men before they realized they were being flanked. Tanner's shotgun boomed from the barn, forcing a group of attackers to scramble for cover. As brass casings rained down and the acrid smell of gunpowder filled the air, John Hawkins felt a familiar calm settle over him. The quiet rancher was gone, replaced by the legendary Gunslinger, who had once been the most feared man in the West. Swift-Hand Hawkins was back, and the night was far from over. The firefight raged on, transforming the once peaceful Whispering Winds Ranch into a war zone. John Hawkins moved like a man half his age, decades of experience guiding every step, every shot. He ducked from cover to cover, his revolvers speaking. With deadly accuracy, "Rollins, watch your 3 o'clock." John's voice crackled over the radio. The deputy swiveled just in time to drop a syndicate member trying to flank her position. "Thanks, Hawkins," she breathed, before refocusing on the battle. From the barn, Tanner's shotgun continued to keep a large group of attackers pinned down. But the sheriff knew he was running low on ammunition. "John, I'm nearly dry here." John replied. In a move that seemed to defy his years, he sprinted across open ground, dodging bullets that kicked up dirt at his heels. He slid into the barn like a baseball player stealing home, a box of shells clutched in his hand. "Damn, John," Tanner said, accepting the ammunition with a grateful nod. "Guess the stories about you weren't exaggerated after all." John allowed himself a grim smile. "Save the compliments for when we're out of this mess." Outside, Jake was growing increasingly frustrated. Half his men were down, and they had yet to even wound the legendary Gunslinger or his allies. "Burn them out!" he roared, his face contorted with rage. Molotov cocktails arced through the air, shattering against the house and barn. Flames licked up the sides of the buildings, casting a hellish glow over the battlefield. "Rollins, fall back to the house," John commanded. "Tanner, you too. We make our stand together." As Rollins and Tanner converged on the house, John provided covering fire. His shots were precise, economical, each one finding its mark. Syndicate members fell left and right, their screams of pain adding to the chaos. Inside the burning house, the trio regrouped. Sweat streaked their faces, mingling with soot and grime, but in their eyes burned a fierce determination. "We're outnumbered," Tanner stated grimly. "Outgunned, too," Rollins added. John checked his ammunition, his face set in lines of stern resolve. "Maybe," he said, "but they're outmatched." With a nod to his companions, John stepped back out onto the porch. The flames cast his shadow long and dark across the yard. For a moment the gunfire ceased as all eyes turned to the figure standing tall amidst the inferno. "Jake!" John's voice boomed across the battlefield. "You wanted Swift Hand Hawkins? Well, here I am. Let's finish this." As if choreographed, Tanner and Rollins took up positions on either side of John, 3 against an army, standing defiant in the face of overwhelming odds. The night was about to witness a showdown for the ages. Time seemed to stand still as John Hawkins faced down the remaining syndicate members. The crackling of flames and the distant howl of sirens faded into background noise. All eyes were on the legendary Gunslinger and his 2 allies. Jake, realizing the tide had turned, stepped forward. "You're good, old man, I'll give you that, but this ends now." John's voice was calm, almost sad. "You're right about one thing, Jake, this does end now. What happened next would be talked about in whispers for years to come." John's hands moved in a blur, faster than seemed humanly possible. 6 shots rang out in rapid succession, each finding its mark with unerring accuracy. 6 syndicate weapons clattered to the ground, their owners clutching wounded hands. In the stunned silence that followed, John's voice carried clearly. "Anyone else want to try their luck against Swift Hand Hawkins?" The fight went out of the syndicate members like air from a punctured balloon. Guns hit the dirt as hardened criminals raised their hands in surrender. Jake, his face a mask of disbelief and fury, made one last, desperate move. He lunged for a fallen weapon, bringing it to bear on John with a cry of triumph. But John was already moving. A single shot rang out, and Jake's gun went spinning away, a perfect hole drilled through its cylinder. "It's over, Jake," John said, softly. It was over before it began. As if on cue, police sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder by the second. The cavalry was arriving, late to the party, but just in time for the cleanup. Tanner stepped forward, his sheriff's badge glinting in the firelight. "John Hawkins, you are under arrest for the murder in Tombstone 20 years ago." A murmur went through the gathered crowd, but John simply nodded, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. Then Tanner continued, his voice ringing with authority. "You have the right to remain silent, although," he added with a wink, "after what we've just witnessed, I'd say you've got one hell of a case for self-defense." As the sounds of approaching vehicles grew louder, John Hawkins stood tall amidst the chaos he had wrought. The silent rancher was gone, and in his place stood a legend reborn, a man who had faced his past and emerged victorious. The night's events had proven that Swift Hand Hawkins was more than just a story. He was a symbol of justice in a wild land, a beacon of hope for those who stood against corruption and violence, and as the first light of dawn began to paint the sky, John knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, he would face them not as a man, running from his past, but as a legend embracing his future. As the sun rose over the Whispering Winds Ranch, the full extent of the night's battle became clear. The once peaceful property was now scarred by bullet holes and scorched earth. Paramedics tended to the wounded, while police officers processed. The arrested syndicate members, John Hawkins, sat on the porch steps, a blanket draped over his shoulders. Despite the chaos around him, he seemed calm, almost relieved. Sheriff Tanner approached, 2 cups of coffee in hand. "Quite a night," Tanner said, offering John a cup. John nodded, accepting the coffee gratefully. "Reckon it was?" They sat in companionable silence for a moment before Tanner spoke again. "John, about Tombstone, I made some calls. Turns out there's been some new evidence come to light. Witness statements that corroborate your story. John's eyes widened slightly. After all these years, Tanner nodded. Seems the truth has a way of coming out eventually. The DA's reviewing the case. There's a good chance all charges will be dropped. For the first time in 20 years, John Hawkins felt the weight of the past lifting from his shoulders. He looked out over his battered but unbroken ranch, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Reckon it's time for a fresh start," he said softly. In the weeks that followed, the town buzzed with activity. The governor's corrupt dealings with the border syndicate came to light, leading to his resignation. The syndicate itself was in disarray, its leadership dismantled and its operations exposed. John Hawkins stood before the judge, his posture straight and proud. The courtroom was packed, filled with townspeople eager to hear the verdict. As the judge announced all charges were dropped, a cheer erupted from the gallery. Outside the courthouse, John was surprised to find a crowd waiting. They weren't there to gawk at a legend, but to thank the man who had protected their homes. Hands reached out to shake his. Voices called out words of gratitude and support. For John Hawkins, it was more than just legal exoneration. It was acceptance, a chance to reconcile his past with his present. As he walked through the crowd, he realized he was no longer running from who he had been. He was finally, truly home. The Whispering Winds Ranch was alive with the sound of hammers and saws. John Hawkins worked alongside his neighbors, rebuilding what had been damaged in the firefight. His legend had not faded, but it had transformed. He was no longer just Swift Hand, Hawkins, the feared gunslinger, but John Hawkins, the protector of their community. As the sun began to set, Sheriff Tanner and Deputy Rollins arrived, carrying a box between them. "Special delivery," Tanner called out with a grin. Inside the box was a shiny new sign for the ranch entrance. It read, "Whispering Winds Youth Ranch, where second chances begin." John ran his hand over the smooth wood, a smile spreading across his face. "Reckon it's time to put these old hands to better use," he said softly. As night fell, John stood on his porch, looking out over his land. The legend of Swift Hand Hawkins would live on, but now it would be a story of redemption, of a man who found his true strength not in his gun, but in his heart. 5 years had passed since the night that changed everything at Whispering Winds Ranch. The property, once scarred by gunfire and flames, now bustled with the energy of youth and the promise of new beginnings. John Hawkins, his hair now more white than grey, stood on the porch of the main house, watching a group of teenagers tend to the horses. The Whispering Winds Youth Ranch had become a beacon of hope for troubled kids, a place where they could find purpose and direction. Sheriff Tanner, now retired, ambled up the path, leaning on a cane. "Quite a sight, isn't it?" he said, nodding towards the kids. John smiled, the lines around his eyes crinkling. "Sure is, Bill. Never thought I'd see the day." As they watched, Deputy Rollins, now Sheriff Rollins, pulled up in her patrol car. She joined them on the porch, her badge glinting in the sunlight. "Got a new batch coming in next week," she announced. 3 kids. Tough cases, but nothing we can't handle." John nodded, his expression serious but hopeful. "We'll give 'em what they need most, a chance." As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the ranch, a young boy approached John. "Mr. Hawkins," he said hesitantly, "is it true what they say? Were you really the famous gunslinger Swift Hand Hawkins?" John knelt down, meeting the boy's eyes. "I was," he said softly. "But you know what? The hardest fight I ever won wasn't with my guns. It was learning to put them down." The boy's eyes widened with understanding. As he ran off to join his friends, John straightened up, feeling the familiar ache in his bones, a reminder of a life lived hard, but, in the end, lived. Well, Tanner chuckled. "Still a legend, after all these years." John shook his head, a wry smile on his face. "Nah, just an old man trying to make up for lost time." As night fell over Whispering Winds Ranch, the legend of Swift Hand Hawkins lived on. But now it was a story of redemption, of second chances, and of the enduring power of change. In the laughter of the kids, in the hope shining in their eyes, the echoes of that legend would resound for generations to come.